of different stakeholders of what I hope everyone has seen as an interesting report, which I know that my colleague Morella has already shared with you. So majority of our participants are coming in from around different parts of the country programming of NGOs around the world. We have quite a fair number of people already on board, but for those online, I won't ask you to introduce yourselves because we're about 50 at the moment, but maybe then I will ask Hugo and Let's to introduce yourselves and your colleague.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Nanki Chavla. I'm the head of the Emergencies Unit at Impact Initiatives.
Yeah, I'm Selena, and I also work at Impact Initiatives and Junior Assessment Officer.
I'm Hugo Slim from the University of Oxford, and thank you all very much for coming.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Mary Lashitarich, Director of Policy at Impact.
Great. I hope everyone's had a chance to take a look at the report and really have what goes next. This roundtable is going to be very, I've been asked to make it as informal as possible. So we have a very much of an open schedule. We'll start off with hearing a little bit from Impact colleagues on the point behind the commissioning of this report, what kind of direction and freedom that was involved in it, and what are we really looking at when we talk about humanitarian needs, and what is the prioritization, and how are we defining needs, as we know that we have a big change and shift in different directions within the sector, and different positions on it, depending upon who we speak to, on everything from boundary setting to real elaboration and adaptation of climate and the impact of climate into humanitarian needs, etc., etc. So we'll start there, and then we have also two colleagues online, I believe, that will make some formal comment and follow up following the presentation. Then it opens to the floor. We'll have a few questions, which I know were shared previously. We'll focus in on those. And again, everything is open for comment and communication. And I would say a constructively critical lens is always appreciated by my good friend Hugo and our friends at Impact. So I will hand the floor over unless there's anything I've forgotten to mention. No, I will do my best to chair and follow up. So please, as you have questions, when we get to that section, to raise your hand online, and I will come to you in order if possible. I did forget something. Apologies. This session is going to be recorded, so unless anyone has an issue, you can also write that in the chat if so. But just to let you know, my colleague Edith in Nairobi will start recording in a minute. Okay, good. Thanks. Over to you. Please.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all so much for being here. We're really excited for what we think is quite an important conversation on how we define and measure humanitarian need and the real world implications this is going to have today on aid delivery. So as I mentioned, I head the Emergencies Unit at Impact, often known as REACH. For those of you who don't know us, we have a field presence in over 30 countries around the world and work to inform evidence-based planning and prioritization. When we were setting out to start this conversation, we were worried that it might seem a little bit technocratic, but we do ultimately feel this is really fundamental to what we do as humanitarians. So at REACH, a lot of our day-to-day work is around trying to figure out who is in humanitarian need and where. And we make choices around things like sampling design, indicator design, thresholds, to present an area, a household, an individual as in need. And although these choices might seem very small scale and technical, they ultimately do help determine who is and isn't in need. And although we do think, as I said, these choices are often perceived as technocratic, we do believe that these are fundamentally ethical choices that we make. So with this in mind, we asked Hugo to help us start to think through the ethical choices that we take when we define, measure, and ultimately inform prioritization of humanitarian assistance. And today we're really hoping for Hugo to share some of the thoughts from his paper and to having an engaging, informative, constructive discussion with all of you. I think this is particularly critical in light of the scale and complexity of emergencies we've seen in the last few years and the impacts of climate change that we are already seeing in action around the world, very much driving and worsening humanitarian need in complex crisis. And then ultimately, we do believe, and I think we've had similar discussions at ICVA before, as humanitarians, we will have to start making more and more difficult decisions as resources become more stretched, and to better choose and justify why and how we're prioritizing these resources. So without further ado, I pass over to Hugo.
Great. Thank you very much, Nanki. And thank you all again. So I'm just going to go through 10 slides just to sort of summarize the report in simple terms so we all have a basic foundation, because I realize it's quite long and you're busy. So I thought I'll just summarize it for you. So humanitarian needs, how shall we define them and prioritize them? That's the challenge. And this is the context in which the report and all of you are busy thinking about this. First of all, the idea that there are rising needs, that climate emergency is increasing, and sadly, war is increasing and escalating too. So perhaps we can expect rising needs in the years ahead. The other thought was that there are certain system habits in the big agencies, and maybe some of your agencies, of what needs are, how you look for them, how you count them. So there's a bit of a sort of habitual approach to needs, which might, usefully be refreshed. And there's also a thought that there's a sort of Christmas tree of accumulating needs. So if you look at needs over the last few years, nobody's really said what constitutes a humanitarian need. They just tend to add one after the other. So we have education, mental health, resilience, all these things come on added as needs. And every year the UN General Assembly reviews the system and tends to add 2 or 3 more, either process needs or outcome needs. So this Christmas tree problem, adding one more need to the tree every now and again. As such, there's no, in a sense, clear IASC concept of humanitarian need. And there's also less money. So while we're talking about more needs, we're talking about less money, which does tend to suggest focus and prioritization is necessary. And the other thing that's interesting is that there are now really increasing overlapping systems which tend to work on the same needs together in the same places, sometimes at the same time. So you have humanitarians, development people, and climate people now, this new crowd around climate, who are all engaged usually around the same sorts of needs. So what's really a humanitarian need in that case? Or do we not need the term anymore and we can just talk about climate needs or whatever? So my task was threefold, and I did it as well as I could over the summer, which was to define a humanitarian need, to simplify the current system of needs, and to begin to prioritize certain needs and areas of needs. So that's what I tried to do, and respond to that from my brief from Impact. So I started, of course, by thinking, let's think what is a need, a general need. And we can say, first of all, that a need is distinct from a want, a desire, or a preference. So a need is different to its linguistic cousins, if you like. It's not a want, it's not a desire, it's not a preference, it's a need. And I need X to bring about Y. So a need also has this important aspect that you need something to create a secondary outcome. So I need food to have sufficient nutrition. I need water not to be thirsty. So in fact, a need is all about delivering an outcome from something. And of course, I thought there's a weak meaning of need. I can say I need a dictionary for a crossword, and that's the correct use of the word need, because it, success in the crossword depends on needing a dictionary. But it's quite a weak thing. I wouldn't say that was an urgent need. So sometimes we're talking about quite weak meanings of need. But there is this strong meaning, which is I need something to stay alive. And that becomes a very strong meaning of the word need. So therefore, the purpose for which we need something determines the significance and moral superiority of a need. So if I need something to do a crossword, it's not really very morally or existentially important. If I need something to stay alive, then it becomes a morally superior need. And if we look at that purpose and the purpose for which we need something, what is your purpose as humanitarians? So what is humanitarian purpose? And of course, there we have to think about our fundamental principle, which is our purpose as humanitarians. And it is quite a simple one, actually, to protect life and health and ensure respect for the human being. So in a sense, those four words in italics, life, health, respect, and human being, those are the key purpose in your field. So if that's humanitarian purpose, what is a humanitarian need? And I'm suggesting it is a need that is something we cannot do without for life, health, and respect, because it must be related to your humanitarian purpose. I'm also suggesting, therefore, that a need is something that has a direct link to harm if we do not have it. And therefore, I quite like this phrase that some moral philosophers use: a humanitarian need reflects a vital interest. And the word vital, as some of you will know, comes from vita in Latin, meaning life. So a humanitarian need represents a life interest, a vital interest. So that's how I'm seeing it. And then if we think of the moral range of humanitarian need, I'm going to say it's largely about life saving, because it's about vital interests. It's about the principle of humanity. It's about life keeping. So it's about keeping people alive as well. In certain very dangerous and extreme situations. But it's not life-making. So it's not about making a richer life, a more prosperous life, a life where you enjoy necessarily all your human rights in some way. It must be linked in some way to life, health, respect of the human being. So I'm arguing in the paper that humanitarian aid is what they call a satisficing project and not an optimizing project. It is to satisfy certain needs for life, health, respect. It is not an optimizing project to try and optimize a whole life across the whole range of rights. And then thinking about how you might simplify humanitarian needs. So if you have that definition, that quite simple definition, how can you simplify the current system that we have? And here I thought it might help to just focus on 4 areas of need, which would give you in agencies and the IASC, as it coordinates humanitarian aid, and OCHA, a simpler dashboard on which you can look and say, these are the areas of need we're trying to meet, and there's only really 4 of them. And they are health needs, the need to health, bodily health, and bodily health and staying alive in health is important to maintain a life, but it's also a fundamental precondition for anyone, for you, me, to realize and meet their other needs. Because if I'm ill, I cannot work, I cannot have a livelihood, etc. So I cannot meet my other needs. So it's health is a precondition for other needs as well as a need in itself. And then I thought there are a lot of social, the area of social need which we need to think about. And 2 main areas. One is that sociality, you might call it conviviality, living together in family, community. That's important. People need to have family, to know where family are, to stay in family and community somehow. But there are the wider associational social needs that you need to be in contact with people, to do business, to have a livelihood, to have a job. So there are, in a sense, economic sociality as well that is important there. And then I thought, and this is drawing on Amartya Sen's idea of capabilities. In the back of the paper, I list 6 approaches to need that I think are being used in different ways in the sector at the moment. Capabilities is one of them. And I think it helps to talk about people's survival capability as a basic need. So some of that is involved in basic literacy, so they can read things, basic knowledge and skills that help them to survive. And this is particularly important, I think, to today in terms of climate services, early warning, all these things, that people have a capability to hear, read, understand early warning, and respond to it with certain skills of adaptation and response and things. And the 4th one, I think if you understand needs, you have to realize that you don't just meet your needs with immediate commodities, but there are whole systems which underwrite your needs. So if I need water, I can have a glass of water, which stops me being thirsty and dying of thirst in the immediate present. But to get that glass of water, I need a water system. So I need pipes and distribution and filtration and, a whole system of water infrastructure. So system needs are about those economic systems, markets, supply chains, infrastructure, energy, health, water infrastructure, and ecosystems, because to survive, people need ecology. We need nature, agriculturally and in other ways. So we need ecosystems too, and sometimes legal systems. So what I'm arguing there is that people have system needs as well, and we need to understand what those are and recognize that when we're supporting a system, we're meeting immediate needs as well. So those are the 4 areas I sort of came up with. And so in summary, before we move on, what I'm arguing in the paper is that life-saving and keeping alive is the parameter of humanitarian needs. Humanitarian aid, therefore, is a satisficing project. It's about satisfying life-essential needs, vital interests. It's not about optimizing a whole life. And therefore, I'm also saying there are 4 areas of need necessary for life, respect, and resilience, and they are health, social, survival capability, particularly for resilience, and respect. And system needs. So that's summarizing, and these are the sort of guiding questions that we're hoping you'll have in the... Sorry, I've now screwed up the computer again. I might have pressed the wrong button, so we're going to have to go back. So 4 guiding questions. Sorry, I'm hopeless with computers, and many other things, actually. So these are 4 guiding questions. What constitutes a humanitarian need? How clear is the current humanitarian sector's definition of needs? I mean, are you very clear about what needs are? How should we change the definition of humanitarian need as the climate emergency intensifies? Do we need to change it now? And how should we prioritize between different humanitarian needs when funding is not sufficient to meet all needs? So that, I hope, when Jamie chairs the general discussion, we can cover those bases. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo. Do you want anything to add? Great. Everybody's still on board and with us. Perfect. I'm going to, in preparation for this, as I said earlier, we have asked 2 colleagues to give kick us off on our feedback and their thoughts. And I hope they're both still online. So why don't we do this? We'll go to Delphine, who is with CARE International as the Humanitarian Policy Advocacy Coordinator and UN Representative. Big, long title, Delphine. But over to you for your initial thoughts and comments, please. And questions.
Right. Yes. Thank you so much. Just checking first that you can hear me okay.
Hear you perfectly well.
All right. Okay. So good afternoon or good day for colleagues who might be in a different time zone. My name is Delphine Pinault and I am CARE's representative in Geneva. I have read actually the paper with a lot of interest. It is indeed an extremely timely conversation. As we all know, having just, of course, in December, launched the 2024 Global Humanitarian Overview. And prior to that, there were really a lot of conversations about what really constitutes a humanitarian need. How do we conduct the right kind of analysis to establish that? But there was also a lot of pressure from donors to come up with an ask that is reasonable and reflects the levels of funding that donors had demonstrated. And I think this is hugely problematic. So I'll come to that. So I'd like to start by appreciating the efforts to offer an alternative and to putting ethics at the center, though very challenging indeed, and also appreciate the humility that that is coming out in the paper. It's a very challenging exercise. It is indeed very timely for all the reasons mentioned in the paper, and not the least indeed the climate threats. The recent efforts to revise the joint intersectoral analysis framework have also shown us that sometimes taking a fresh view, a fresh start, like this paper is trying to do, may be easier than revising approaches and models that are deeply embedded in a system that is willing but really struggling to change. And thank you as well for putting a mirror in front of us and warning for, and I want to believe this is more an inadvertent and not a deliberate objective, but for the what you call the confirmation bias and the fact that we may inadvertently be sometimes more driven by organizational needs than actually the needs of people. It is really something that I think we need to confront, it's not an easy one. There's also a balancing act there, because we do need local, national, international organizations to actually meet the challenge, to respond to needs, but obviously our own organizational existence should not be the first concerns. I just mentioned the GHO for 2024. Compared to the last year, there were approximately 64 million people in need less, and that is partly the result, we believe, of donor pressure. And we really value here and appreciate OCHA's and the various humanitarian country teams' efforts to prepare evidence-based appeals. We also recognize that there's a lot of constraints to conduct needs assessments in specific contexts, and it's important really to uphold impartial and strictly needs-based targeting approaches. You mentioned also the importance of ensuring that gender, age, ethnicity, disability, and all these factors continue to be considered in this new, more ethical approach. And this is something that is also appreciated. We are a bit concerned that in the last exercise to come up with this 2024 GHO, this may not always have been the case. So we, as CARE, speaking really only for our organization, and I have to say, I'm not even sure I can say that we haven't had time to have an in-depth conversation about the paper. So perhaps I should say these are more personal views, but certainly agree with the fact that humanitarians should be refocusing more on basic, essential life-saving needs. But it's also critical to do that while continuing to call for addressing poverty. Please. And investments in systems. You mentioned system needs in your...
Okay.
Excuse me.
No, you're fine. No, you're fine. I would just, no, not at all. So I would just like to encourage everyone not speaking, just to make sure you're on mute. Daphne, over to you, please.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. On the point of addressing as well the systems needs, I think this really actually calls for, and I'm curious to hear your views on the fact that we need to do joint analysis. And in order to be having a clear role for humanitarian actors responding to more strictly humanitarian needs, we need to see more investments as well in reducing needs. We need to operationalize this concept that we've been, talking about for over a decade now, which is nexus. More ODA has to go to the fragile and conflict settings, to the climate hotspots. And for that, it really requires more joint analysis of needs, poverty needs, humanitarian needs between the development, the humanitarian, and actually the peace actors. And that's the bit that I don't see very well articulated in the paper, is how do we take this new approach into still, a concept of reducing needs on the one hand and having more converged, coherent development and humanitarian investments overall. Because to a large extent, and then perhaps I'll close here, I think the reason why humanitarian actors have slowly but surely done more and more and more, it's been to respond to the failure of development actors very often to continue to invest in the various infrastructure, in the various systems, or in poverty alleviation. For a number of reasons, often very political, I won't go there, but I think it's also important to put this into the context of the root causes of why humanitarians have ended up doing a lot more than what perhaps their humanitarian mandate prepares them to do. So yeah, I'll stop here. These are just a few quick reflections. Over.
I think there were more than a few quick ones. I thought you put a lot of effort into that, and I appreciate that very much. You've articulated some of my thoughts when I read the paper as well, and I would raise up. So thank you very much, Daphne. I think that's a super way to kick us off into this section of the discussion. So if you want, we can go to Jamal now, and then, yes. So our next member of our team and coming in to give a kickoff to the rest of us to think through is Jamal Abdu. Are you here with us? So he is the CEO. Great. I don't see you, but I can hear you. So thanks.
Sorry, I will not be able to open the camera because of the internet.
Okay, no problem. No problem. And so Jamal is with Tamdeen Youth Foundation, Yemen. So over to you.
Thank you very much for giving me the chance to participate in this roundtable. And I really appreciate the effort put in to the paper. I went through it and I found it it's very exciting, and it's touch the needs, or it's touch what's in our mind about prioritizing or defining the needs. One thing that I need to emphasize that there is a lot of factors putting on defining the humanitarian needs, and also it depends on the context. Defining the humanitarian needs is differ from one context to other context because of the changing of the cultural change, the environmental impact, and also different factors that happened to affect how do we define or prioritize the needs. Just regarding the guiding questions that has been put on this, because of the humanitarian needs is a requirement for assistance. And the humanitarian is arise from a crisis such as natural disaster, armed conflict, and other emergencies threatening the well-being or the survival of the affected individual. And I really just appreciate that you defining or simplifying the needs to the 4 category, which is touch the basis of this. I think the current definition of the humanitarian needs within the sector is generally clear in identifying the basic requirements for survival and well-being in crisis situation. However, there may be a variation in interpretations of and application across the definition or different organization and context. Same as I mentioned before, that the context is play a role on how we define the needs. Also, when the climate emergencies or the climate emergencies are just increasing now, the definition of the humanitarian needs also should evolve to encompass the specific challenges posed by the climate-related disasters, because humanitarian disasters or armed conflict disasters are vary or the need for to respond to it is different from responding to the climate related disaster. This may include also the increasing of frequency or severity of the extreme weather events and the displacement of population due to the environmental change. And this also play a great role to determine the affected people, or how much individual or how many individuals that has been affected. Also, when there is insufficient need or insufficient funding, because now we have to prioritize the need, because now we know that the demand increased and available funding on hand is decreased. So this the funding now is not insufficient to meet all humanitarian needs. So the prioritization, it becomes essential. This process also, the process of prioritizing the needs or prioritizing the response should be guided by a principle of the four principle of impartiality, necessity, and urgency. Also, the prioritization also involves assessing the severity of the need and how much impact that or the potential impact of the intervention. Sometimes, yes, there is a severity need, but the potential impact will not be seeing. So we have to prioritize or do a win-win approach to clarify or to choose the most or the more prioritizing the more area in need, and the capacity and the capacity also of the responser, though to address underlying also the vulnerability. Also, it's important to engage with the affected communities to prioritize the needs also, or prioritize the response, to understand their perspective, and prioritization or can inform effective and equitable decision making in allocated limited resources. So that's part of the accountability to the affected population, that we have been to involve them on prioritizing the need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamal. You've also added a fair number of points there that are super helpful for, I think, as we go forward. So how would you like to do it? Do you want to respond to these two first?
No, I think let's keep going, because we want to hear from people. So we could take the slides down and see people.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much. So I hope you've made note of these 4 guiding questions. And I'm going to take away the slides as soon as I figure out how the heck I do that.
Don't help.
I hope I don't need help, Hugo, but thanks for offering.
I'm really good at it.
Stop sharing. How do I stop sharing in the meantime? In the meantime, I want to, Jeremy's going to help me. There's a couple of points that come out of, thank you, shukran. There were a couple of points that came out during the discussion, which I want to just highlight so that you don't see in the chat. And that is from Anne-Christine Bloch. So she made 2 points, Hugo, maybe you want to come back to. Isn't it dignity rather than respect? and then add and participation of people we serve in defining the needs, which also reaffirms what Jamal was saying. So the participatory relationship, as we all call it nowadays, the participation revolution. I've been away from Geneva for a few years, so it's interesting. So with that in mind, we see Lisa and Miro. So I'm not sure which one. I don't know, Lisa, if you have your hand up. No, you do not. You look surprised that I mentioned you, so it's okay. So Miro, over to you, please, and just introduce yourself for our speakers.
Good afternoon. My name is Miro Modushan. I'm Geneva representative for Intersos, which is a humanitarian organization. Thank you very much, Jamie and Mirella, for organizing this really interesting discussion. And thank you, Hugo, for your interesting and rather thought-provoking paper. I'll try to be brief. I have two comments and kind of questions. The first one is a little bit along the lines of what Delphine spoke about. I mean, I really appreciate the rationale that you put out in the paper that we need to try to, let's call it, streamline humanitarian aid and really focus on humanitarian issues strictly, rather than kind of address more broader needs of the communities, which is something that I think the humanitarian system has been a little bit pushed to address ever since the World Humanitarian Summit. So personally, I really agree that humanitarians should be focused on pure humanitarian issues. However, I think that at the same time, many of the needs that are not so narrowly life-saving or humanitarians are also still valid and relevant. And given that we often work in all these protracted crises, if they are not addressed, they will lead to more vulnerability and further increase humanitarian needs. And I think at the same time, we see, anyway, from my perspective, and maybe someone can challenge me on that, I think that the current development assistance is not really present in a major way in major protracted crises, and it is not operationalized in a way that would lead towards the gradual reduction of needs. So what are your thoughts on that? And if you agree with that, how can this operationalization of development finally happen? And then my second point is, again, really, I read your paper with interest. I think it's really interesting, and there's a lot there. And I think I have more than two questions, but looking into, for example, how you argue that the humanitarian needs also need to adapt in the light of future possible massive increase in humanitarian needs linked to the climate emergencies. I personally wonder if the scenario of climate emergencies that basically has no boundaries, where basically it affects also countries that are currently major donors, and these donor governments will also increasingly have to use more resources to respond to the needs back at home. So there's going to be probably huge pressure to the international humanitarian assistance. So how do you see international humanitarian assistance in the future in the light of this problem? Thank you.
Again, not the little questions, big questions there. Thanks very much, Miro. I think I think these are all interlinking as well in many ways. I will come to the room in a minute, but let's stick online. Thanks again. Don't forget to raise your hand if you have a question. So I'm going to go over now to Fred, who is going to introduce himself, and he has a really interesting question for us.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm called Fred Wander. I work for Help Aid International. I'm based in Uganda. I oversee the African program, the humanitarian program in Africa. Just basically my question, depending, based on your definitions, intrigued me to ask a very critical question that we faced under the Horn of Africa drought response, where despite the several appeals and efforts that were done by several international organizations, UN agencies, and all the coordination mechanisms, in some circles, it didn't meet the threshold to qualify for funding appeals, including the DEC in the UK. And immediately we started seeing people dying, and then up to today, I don't think we, as the international community, including the local agencies that were involved, were able to meet the needs of the communities that were involved. Because with the slow onset, I think there is this narrative that we start waiting for a certain number of people to die before we think it is worth responding to. But then immediately after, we have had the El Nino effect, and we have flooding coming in the same region. Still, the response seems to be quite very, very appalling to me, because we haven't really supported the community. So when I looked at the definition, and basically our colleague from CARE who mentioned that sometimes it's because of the failure of the development actors to do certain responses. I just ask myself, where do we draw the line on based on that definition of humanitarian need? I don't know whether my question is understood. Thank you.
I like the fact you have the core humanitarian standard behind you. It's very, it's excellent.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Yeah.
Fred's question leads into something I was thinking about as well when I was, so when we were looking at needs assessment in my last mission, which was Iraq, and of course there we no longer have a humanitarian crisis, as we're told we do, or the world does still have a humanitarian crisis there, even though some people don't think so, UN. But the reality is that then the needs assessment became very complex. Because how do you focus on, this is my positing of question, how are we focusing on the deviations or differentiation between life-keeping and life-saving without having some component of life-making? And for me, that means humanitarian needs must include or encapsulate some sense of hope, of either improvement, betterment of one's life. It doesn't mean that we have to respond with monetary or tangible response, but our assessment of needs, I believe, should comply with something about the need for hope. And I think that's sort of what Fred was saying, and to a certain extent what Miro was saying as well. I just think that by excluding it from a definition of need, are we not then making the humanitarians struggle harder to find a way of delivery against that? So in the room, I have my colleagues Jeremy and Mirella, and if you have questions online, please don't be shy and raise your hand. We have gone from, we're sitting around 80 participants. So Jeremy.
Thank you, Hugo. Jeremy Willard with ICVA here. One simple question for you. Suddenly, we as the sector are really also focused on the issue of needs and prioritization because of reduced funding. I mean, this is what's driving a whole lot of the urgency around us grappling with these issues right at the moment. So I'm interested in your thoughts from an ethical, moral perspective on the weight of the efficiency argument in actually how the organizations meet need. I mean, if we're talking about needing to prioritize to get more and more effectively targeting within that funding availability and that shrinking window, then how much should we be also looking internally at that inward efficiency, and is there an ethical view on that would help some organizations with the processes to think through? Thanks.
I don't have a question as such, but I also wanted to react to the point of Jamie, Fred, and Miro. I mean, in previous experiences, I worked at a certain point for an organization working on child rights. And if you speak to the children, they would say, like girls, for example, not being able to go to school anymore. They would say, like, what is my life now worth it? So it's easy for us, I think, theoretically, to make a difference between life-keeping and life-making. But we have also to recognize that the two in practice go very strongly together. There is, of course, a subjective element, but putting that subjective element outside, we still have all of us have a broad understanding not only of life keeping as such, but also some quality behind, even though it remains a minimum quality. But you know, we have all this recognition of the rights. So many people see the worth of a life connected to access to the rights, at least in very general life, you know. So how do you see this issue, and what is the feedback that you got also by engaging with different organizations? And then maybe also to the concept of protection. And yeah, because life keeping and protection might not necessarily be the same if you interpret life keeping very narrowly. But again, we know that there is some more behind, something more behind. Thank you.
How would you like to proceed? Because we are getting a queue.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm happy to take some now, or we can just wait right till the end and I'll just think about everything, which might be the better way, really.
We have about 40 minutes, so
yeah,
you just...
so long as we have sort of 20 minutes at the end.
Okay.
But just thank you all so far, and please attack the report. You're being very kind in asking me questions, but please do. It's not a precious report. It's a conversation starter. So, you know, do attack where you disagree, or, you know, support where you agree. Yeah.
Okay, so if that's the case, we'll continue forward.
I think
then.
so, yeah.
Rudiger, over to you, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I was hesitant to take the floor because I haven't read the full report. So I really appreciate your summary right now. And I'm just also asking another question rather than answering any of your guiding questions, Hugo. But I really found the point around the slow onset versus sudden onset really important, because it leads also to the question about anticipation and responding. And how do we balance the two of them? While we know that anticipation is morally better and cheaper, but we struggle to get the appropriate funding, and we have to balance it against existing life, say, vital needs, as you called them. So I just think it's another dimension to think about. We cannot just look at what needs are there we need to respond to, but how do we balance that against the needs that we can potentially prevent. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so it is a queue getting longer. Aftab, I would like to go to you, Aftab Alam.
Hi. Thanks, Hugo, for the beautiful presentation. I have one question on this. I'm very much fascinated by the point you mentioned. Is as humanitarian aid is a satisfying project and not an optimizing project. It's very interesting. If I take an example in the Horn of Africa response, especially in hunger response we have in Ethiopia, I was there. And maybe we as an agency or an ex-agency responded to the crisis on the needs, and maybe they covered 50% of the minimum expenditure basket. So are we trying to say, is this a satisfying or is it not satisfying? But for me, it is 50% satisfying. But on the same scenario, maybe we or the ex-agency tries to mobilize additional 50% of the minimum expenditure basket, and then caters to some percent, not 100% of the people of the caseload, but maybe certain percentage. So there we come to the stage of optimizing. So how do we draw a line between satisfying and optimizing? That is, I would like to be more clear on that. Thank you. I hope I'm clear.
You are. Thanks. Lisa, I knew that you were going to ask a question. How did I know?
Yeah, I was also hesitant because I also haven't read the full report. I'm Lisa. I'm with the Danish Refugee Council here, and I work on mine action and peace building, but I also serve as the coordinator of the mine action AOR together with UNMAS. So in the mine action field, when we think about sort of a task or an area that is contaminated, it's always about risk. So maybe the question of residual risk, right? What is the remaining residual risk is one that is potentially relevant here, because we're looking at essentially prioritizing certain areas. Mine action, it's always about prioritizing a certain area of land that can then be utilized or has to be cleared. And of course, there's the life-saving element in mine action as well. But there has been a lot of conversations, and the question regarding the development area or development aid in general, and the transition from humanitarian to development is sort of linked to that. And I feel like there needs to be some sort of sequencing mechanism, or at least we need to figure out a better transition between one or the other. And I think the classification that you've mentioned have been extremely helpful. So thank you so much for that. And I'm also thinking about whether there is a way we can somehow classify different countries according to different ways. We're speaking of the issue of protracted, what type of aid is relevant in these kind of settings? There's always that call for more flexible aid. Humanitarian aid is necessarily, sort of very targeted and short term in many situations. Still, that doesn't go in line with anticipation and anticipatory action. So, I think those are all the thoughts that sort of sprung up in my head when you were talking. So, thanks so much.
Thanks, Lisa. Nanki, do you want to add anything?
I can wait till
okay, great. Over to Anne-Christine.
Just hope that my battery is not running low here. So I want to go back to this hope, because I do think that is actually quite crucial for keeping people alive. And I would say linked to the hope is also that we deal with the trauma that people often come out with, for instance, from war situations. We've seen it both in Ukraine, and we're also seeing it coming out with the people who are coming out of Sudan right now. In fact, one of the key services we are providing as the first emergency service is mental health and psychosocial support in order for people to function at any level. So I do think that the mental health is really a very crucial part of the health parameter we are talking about in the 4 boxes. Education, coming back to education, I think if you are asking in most situations what young people want in an emergency situation, it would be access to education, because without education, they see no hope, they have no future. And I think it's very easy for us to sit and say this is not a life-saving and life-keeping need, but in essence, this is the need that youth most often prioritize above everything else. So that was just my comments.
Thanks very much for that. Just if I could take chair's prerogative for a second, I also think that that's interesting, because I would be interested to know if it's education in emergencies that we would see as a humanitarian need, or if it's education service provision, which are very different things, right? And because in the Rohingya response, we would be guaranteed that if we said to families, here's your needs assessment, they would be desperate to find out why. Because again, it's not about hope for them. I think education is seen as life-saving, but future building, and then that becomes life-making. And I would just be interested to see if you think it's need, or if it's a want, a desire, a preference. Because I like this I liked that initial discussion, and I think we've moved a little bit past that in the rest of the commentation. But I do think that education is a really good one. Mental health, excellent, and thank you for Anne-Christine for raising it. So we have 3 more with their hands up, and the first one on my list is Gareth Smith.
Thanks, Jamie. Gareth here. I'm the former Syria NGO Forum Director and doing some research work at the moment. Thanks Hugo, thanks Nanki and Reach. I think it's critical that like with grappling with this now, and so thanks for kind of pushing the conversation in a sense. I think for me, we're going to see, increasing risks from the climate crisis, but you're also going to see a change in the nature of crisis, right? So it becomes more pervasive and community resilience is eroded on a grander scale. And I think we need to be, so I think in a sense, we need NGOs to be pushing for a kind of leadership voice on where do we go with the humanitarian system as a result of that? So thanks for pushing that. I just kind of have a quick reflection on, I think sometimes we think of this as an either or, like if humanitarians pull back from sort of that longer term support, then it simply doesn't happen. But I want to flip that around a little bit and actually ask if humanitarians are necessarily the best people to be focused on that, right? Because I think what we've ended up with in many of these protracted crises is a situation where you have like crisis responders essentially doing long-term sort of governance support, providing all basic services in some areas in a way that the kind of is a kind of pseudo-state function. And realistically, to actually do that well and to be doing it in a way that's accountable to populations would require a very, very different modality. And it may be the only option, but I think there's an argument we're possibly providing an excuse for those political processes, development process, policy discussions not to actually work so effectively. And so actually flipping it around, is there a risk of us in essentially creating harm by doing that? So yeah, the kind of flip side is that we're also ending up in situations where you have recurrent crises where the sort of humanitarian system, in air quotes, is kind of pivoted to a long-term support function, and you have no crisis responders, and you sit in HCTs and ICCGs with where people are not used to responding to emergencies which are cropping up. So I guess long-winded way of saying, like, I think pushing this conversation is great, and I would sort of, urge us towards thinking kind of, can we tighten a focus on crisis response at the same time as actually pushing for that longer term piece outside of the humanitarian system and asking for it. That was a slight ramble, sorry, but yeah, some thoughts.
Thanks. Two more, and then that will bring us sort of 20 minutes to the conclusion, yeah? Okay, Berke, you're next.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Jamie, and everyone there on the screen. Very nice to see you. Thanks a lot, Hugo, for the paper, and just like everyone else, just a brief glance through. I think, first of all, I think it's great that in the definition of the humanitarian needs, you actually had a human-centered and AAP approach to actually define, what affected populations and affected communities think about what their needs are, rather than us having a certain opinion about it. And obviously that, knowing what the communities feel as their needs, that this is informing and influencing the global discussion. Jamie, just on the issue of hope, particularly you mentioned Iraq, we're looking at the DRC, we're looking at South Sudan, we're looking at Afghanistan. So all of these protracted crises. So how long can you keep hope alive? Move from life-saving to life-keeping, but also at which level of the life-keeping, and I think earlier the audience, some people in the audience mentioned respect and dignity. So, if I look at the Eastern DRC, it looks pretty grim. Ituri, for instance, where constantly people are being, massacred. So what is the kind of standard that one can actually keep? The question for me is also around the system change, and I think one aspect of it was mentioned earlier in the report around system habits by agencies. So obviously, how can we inform and how can we make change possible with the trends over the past 20 years, where humanitarian organizations only had a single mandate, and now everyone is having a dual mandate, moving into the triple nexus. Shouldn't we go back to our original mandate then, and let others do their jobs? Or do we actually need to accept the realities of saying, we need to be a jack of all trades, but then at the same time, master of none? Or can we say we're going to be master of one, at least picking one or two areas where we can be more of benefit. I think from what I read in your paper, you quote, unless we recognize such extraordinary needs, it makes no sense to have a humanitarian sector or humanitarian aid. So that brings me back to the question of mandates and system habits and how, organizations, all of us like us here, or the UN agencies can actually change to enable a more targeted humanitarian assistance that doesn't get watered down by the extraordinary needs that I think we all do recognize. So yeah, just a little bit, if you could at the end be creative about conclusions and probably some suggestions, that would be great. Yeah, just to say, Berke with Trokra, Heads of Portfolio for Fragile and Conflict Affected States. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Berke. We have the three and then I'll close, right? So we have, in this order, we have Alam, Alice, and David. And then we'll stop, then we'll turn over to our good colleagues. So Alim, please. Alham, sorry. Going once. Going twice. You're coming.
We don't hear you.
Okay, can I go to Alice and then we'll come back to you, okay? So Alice, please.
Hi everyone, thank you. And just thanks to ICVA for organizing a great discussion, and to Reach and Hugo for great thinking and work, and a fantastic paper that I also encourage everyone to read in full. I'm Alice Obrecht from LNAP, and just to do a little bit of self-promotion, we're doing a podcast on the similar topics, so it's something to look out for, and we're happy to talk to anyone who has interesting examples of solutions to some of these very important and thorny questions that Reach and Hugo have been posing. I just want to pick up Hugo's suggestion, so I'm not going to ask you a question, Hugo, because I think you have a long list of them, but that this is meant to be a discussion starter and maybe provide some challenge back to others in the room. We've done a couple of evaluation syntheses recently, one on the HDP nexus and the other one on the humanitarian systems response to COVID-19. And a consistent theme coming out of that goes to this issue that a number of people have asked about or spoken to around, has the humanitarian mandate stretched too far, the dual mandate question, we need to go back. I think what's quite clear is that humanitarians are very happy to be the doers, actually, when they get the money. And they're not very good, or we haven't seen a lot of great examples or innovative examples of how humanitarians try to play around with different roles to complement and support and provide technical advice to the other actors that they think should be doing these services if and when they need to pull out. And so I wonder if there's others on the call who have seen this at work or who have examples of why that hasn't worked successfully. But to me, it's a critical part to this prioritization issue. If we're going to have a clearer, more streamlined understanding of what the humanitarian job is, let's also include a role for the technical advising and connecting work that can be done with development actors, even if we're not the ones who are getting the money per se. So I'll just leave with that, and thank you for the discussion.
That's great, and I think you also lead us to the discussion of why can't we say no when a donor comes and says, can you do this? And we say yes, because we often think about the percentage of support costs that we can develop and keep our offices open and operating in other directions as well. I think we have to be braver as not just respondents, but also braver in our relationships with other actors. And Davide, over to you. Or David, I'm not sure. Apologies.
Thank you very much, everybody. My name is Davide. I'm also working for Impact Initiative in a country office. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Hugo, for the paper and the excellent reflections we had. So I just want to go through the comment I put on the chat. Like, it seems that emergency humanitarian work has been focusing heavily on physical and biological need, like food, shelter, and water, especially if you compare the funding and the priorities on social, psychological, and psychosocial needs. that are seen like at best secondary when they are. Aspirations and context-based desire from the population are rarely asked, to my experience, or maybe not really analyzed in the depth that they should be. This, I think, is based on a concept that like biological and physical issues can be effectively addressed without taking care of the psychosocial dimensions, the aspiration and the desire of the affected population, especially those ones that are just coming out from a crisis. There is a participation revolution, Jamie, as you said, and we might find out in the end of the road that what we think our needs might be different at the end. Lastly, Hugo, in your paper, like you mentioned that we went too far in our ambition, like mentioning a study exploring well-being as an objective of the sector. Well, I'm not, allow me to disagree. I believe that we're asking exactly what is important for the people and what people need in their life and what they're prioritizing most. And I think this participation sprout that we are having now in our work is exactly trying to do that. Thank you.
Great. Anna, are we able to go to you now? We can't hear you. Maybe if possible, you could add your question into the chat because it is now 20 minutes to the nose. See, I may not be good at many things, but maybe I can share. Who knows? But I will hand over to you. There is a good question by Andrea in the chat, which I will maybe leave us with. But please have a look at it. Thank you.
Do you want to say anything?
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm happy to. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the incredibly useful comments. I think you've left us with a lot of food for thought that we can take from here and think through how we're going to take this forward for us as an organization and then with other stakeholders moving forward as well. I think a couple of points, maybe reflections from our side, listening to some of the comments today. I think one of the pieces that really struck me is the point on hope and that question of, can you provide hope? Is there dignity in providing life-saving assistance? And I would say ultimately, what for me, and I'll speak from a personal perspective here rather than an agency one, is that perhaps this is the point of exactly why we need to be more open as a sector on what we can do so that we can do it well. And that we're able to conduct the best possible job at supporting populations, often in the worst possible circumstances, often facing a risk of loss of life. And even if we do provide that, that doesn't mean that that's the end, of course, right? I think that we sometimes see this as a dichotomy of what we can provide and then not sufficiently taking into account what others can. I really liked the framing on the need for joint analysis across these different actors and across this broader spectrum. I think we have a lot of discussions in the humanitarian sector on better delineating responsibilities and roles, and that's something that, let's be honest, we've found very difficult in practice. But are we able to find pragmatic referral pathways in some way at country level that can actually work within these different actors? Given that coordinating across the nexus has continued to be a big challenge. And I do think ultimately we need to be a little bit more transparent on what the needs actually are and what our capacity is to respond to them, which I think is sometimes something that's conflated when in fact that in and of itself is quite an important point for us to advocate around as a sector. And then finally, I think for us, and this is an organizational point, is we really see this as an opportunity to think about how to better center the perspectives of affected populations, to inform how we prioritize, how we plan. I do think needs assessments can go a long way in supporting this, but of course, we still have a long way to go as a sector in this participation revolution. And then finally, I think we must be maybe pragmatic that humanitarians are prioritizing anyway, that we are seeing that happen in practice because of this lack of funding. And so do we think it is possible to find a shared ethical framework to do so? And are there steps that we can take, even just as the NGO community as a starting point to move the needle forward? And I don't think we have answers to that yet, but we are keen to continue this conversation. Over to you, Hugo.
Great, thank you, Nanki. Well, thank you all very much. As Nanki says, that's a really helpful discussion for us. And if I start by thinking of our virtual room as a whole, three big themes seem to be jumping out of this room. And the first is, as you'd expect, there are some people that seem to lean towards wanting more streamlining. So yeah, let's focus more, let's streamline more, let's be more specific about humanitarian needs. And of course, there are others saying it's not that simple, and actually we need to realize that people think that express their needs as quite optimizing rather than satisfying. So the tension is in the room that you're probably experiencing on the ground, and it's in the debate too, obviously, the policy debate. The second thing that's come out of this room, more than actually where we were at IFRC the other day in a different way here, is boundaries. So a lot of you have worried about, where is the boundary between life-keeping, life-making, life-saving, etc. Where are you going to find these boundaries in your basket of goods, as one of you had, or in other ways you're working? And then the third thing that's come up very strongly that Nanki's already mentioned, which is the intangibles, if you like, of people's life objectives, like hope and a future. Those sort of intangibles have come up in this room a bit more than in the others. So thank you for that. And thank you, Delphine and Jamil, for launching us off and with your good comments, often about process and things which are really important in the system and the process of analysis and the process of prioritizing. If I just go through what I've heard and just respond a little to some of these. And Anna Christine, you mentioned, isn't it, dignity rather than respect? I mean, in the fundamental principle, in the humanitarian principle, it's respect, actually. But of course, in the human rights tradition, it's dignity, and humanitarianism has swallowed a lot of human rights in the last 20 years or so. So it's talking dignity as much as the human rights movement now. But, that's not actually, when you all say we're a principled organization, I suppose it's in the humanitarian charter probably, but the first principle of humanity is really respect. But of course, they're similar, aren't they? So they're the same sort of thing. And they can be a little intangible too, dignity and respect as well. But you find them very often in ways people find their lives. So if they feel heard, if they're fed, if they feel they have agency in their lives, survival capability, etc., systems supporting them, then they tend to find respect and dignity, whatever we want to call it. Participation, I agree. I think that's probably not in the paper enough as a sort of social need. And I think that is important because it's about agency as well. So participation as the process of working with people, how you do it, should be met both in survival capability. You enable people to participate for their survival, but also in the social need that they want to work together socially to achieve life-saving, life-keeping, whatever. On the whole mental health education thing, I'm not particularly worried about that. I don't think, education is quite simple in a way. You can say it meets a social need. You can say very strongly that actually one of the best things for children and for society at large and community is to get schools of some sort started in an emergency, because it allows people to remember who they are, what they're trying to do. It gives children communities. So that would be a social need to me. And also you could say it's very important to survival capability. So I could find it in two of my four boxes in a sense, pretty simply, but I probably wouldn't say university education is a humanitarian need. In fact, I wouldn't. So I would be much more basic in humanitarian needs in a sense. Mental health, I say in the paper, look, I think, we can't go into every mind and every person as humanitarian agencies. And I think if you're getting certain processes right in community recovery, then the community will help people to recover. And I think mental health only becomes a major priority for humanitarian agencies if it's not happening in the community, or there's so much distress and sadness in the community. The community is really not able to heal itself at the moment. So I think you have to make that judgment. I don't think you should rush in and say we always need mental health humanitarian aid. It depends on how the community is doing, I think, but I may be wrong and not understand it enough. So protracted stuff. I think it's a really interesting point that Miro made, that if you don't deal with longer term needs now, they will soon, and prevent them, they will become immediate needs in 6 months' time or something. So on the whole, and other people raise that anticipation point as well. I'm just trying to see who, yeah, so Rudiger, you raised the question of anticipation and risk. A risk isn't yet a moment of life-saving, it's a possible moment of life-saving. So I'm saying, yeah, that's a vital interest. A humanitarian need, you need something to stop something else happening, to stop harm. So anticipation is really good. It's survival capability to me. If you're doing good anticipatory aid, you're enabling people to survive, you're improving their capability to survive. So it meets that need very clearly. So I don't have a problem with anticipation. Fred's question about, and I can't do them all, I'm afraid, largely because I don't have answers to them all, but rather than volume. Fred, your question is a really interesting one about, when the humanitarian needs begin. Why isn't your emergency an emergency when other people's are? And I think that's quite interesting, but again, I'm afraid I'm pretty hard on that. And I would say, look, for it to be a real humanitarian need and to be a real humanitarian emergency, it must cross some sort of threshold of scale. It must sort of hit national or international, scale in some way. Yeah, because you can have lots of little emergencies. And my wife works in the British Red Cross, and she's constantly in London dealing with gas explosions that displace 50 people, or she's doing cold weather at the moment for homeless people. Well, yeah, okay, she's British Red Cross. I'm not going to call that a massive humanitarian emergency. I'm not sure there's a humanitarian needs. There's sort of natural emergency needs for certain people. But I do think size, it is significant, because we're talking about the international system here, responding and supporting national systems in a way. Jamie, your whole point about the boundary between life-saving and life-keeping, and don't you need somehow life-making to... I was saying the other day, how do you keep the keep? Maybe how do you sustain life-keeping? Again, I can be quite minimalist on this, because I can go back to the old word. When I started in the 1980s, we didn't talk about humanitarianism in the Anglo-Saxon culture. We talked about relief, and we were relief workers. We weren't humanitarian workers. And of course, the French people can correct me if I'm wrong, but the word relief comes from relever, to lift up again. So in a sense, I would see your purpose as lifting people up again, getting them on their feet. But then it's up, it's their agency that then has to do the keeping. And, so I put in this paper, I recognize personal, individual responsibility for survival. You're not responsible for survival all the way. And as many of you have said, and as Garth was saying just now, it's for other parts of the system to then pick up other longer life-making bits. And I think you might want to be quite firm about that increasingly in some way. So I think relief is still quite a good word, because it keeps you focused on getting people back on their feet and supporting their survival capability. But you don't have to live their lives for them and live with them all the way and support every aspect of their life. That's hard, but there you are.
Oh, okay.
We can, I'll just go. Jeremy, your point on efficiency in inside agencies is probably a bit subtle for me. I'm not very good in agencies. But I think you're right. I think we need to look at what agencies need to be to meet needs. And some of them are probably too big, too expensive, too overstaffed. They don't need to be like that to meet needs. And I think that's the sort of point you're making, that I think efficiency in agencies is a key part of, being the optimal shape to do the satisficing project, and not the optimal shape to be doing the optimizing project, in a sense. where's protection? Yeah, well, where's protection even when we have it sometimes? You know, when we're paying huge sums for it, it often doesn't work, I suppose, Morella. And I think I'm putting protection here in health because I'm saying that, in fact, safety, you know, you're not going to be healthy, you're not going to be alive if you're not safe. So I think that, you know, a large part of health is safe space, safe environments. That, you know, you've got to be safe to be healthy, or you're going to be attacked and hurt and killed, and sexual violence will be there, etc., etc. But I think survival capability must also include protection. And, you know, we know that a lot of important work is coming out saying that actually self-protection, community-based protection is extremely important. So that would be a survival capability need to me, you know, which would be there somehow. And then, of course, Aftab asked, where's the boundary, you know, the boundary question between satisficing and optimizing. And again, I'd probably draw it quite hard. You know, I'd say, you know, if people are alive and if they're basically staying alive, you don't have to do everything about their lives. So I would slightly disagree. Well, David knows I disagree. We don't have to have a whole well-being objective about that. And then thinking again about hope, you know, that Berke brought it up, and Christine and others. I think in a sense, and again, I'm going to sound hard on this, but if people are coming to you as humanitarians and saying, you know, but, you know, we need help with hope and we need help with a future, etc., you might say to them, well, you're talking to the wrong people. You should be talking to your government, or you should be making a government that provides that sort of thing. Why are you asking an emergency agency for a future? So I'll be quite hard there and provocative and say no. And maybe this is part of the problem with our system that, you know, Garth mentioned, that if you keep citizens facing humanitarian agencies, they're constantly asking the right question to the wrong people. Mm-hmm. They should turn around to their government and say, let's get a political contract about our future, damn it, you know, which is what most societies have to do at some point, and form some kind of government and political contract that's real. So I'll stop there and hope that makes some points, and I hope I don't sound like a sort of hardline thug, but I probably do.
No. I don't think a hardline thug is the words that pop in my mind, but I think this ought to have been a dialogue with, and you're making me think a lot about how do we, as we're all looking at, you know, be it at the interagency ISC structure model discussions, if it's at country level or regional level, and we're trying to look at it, how do we look and define needs and prioritize needs after we are already either seeing the envelope that's available or guessing at the envelope and then thinking about needs. I will wrap up this discussion, but I do want to, I think it has to be a dialogue, and because I'm thinking through all different analogies and situations where I've recently been in where we've had colleagues say, well, look, you have to learn that we are going to leave people behind, and we're going to leave people behind because they haven't reached the quota of need, and the need is not just one area of response, but it has to be a whole need, and then it has to be a societal question. It can't be just one or two individuals living within a society. It has to be deeper than that. So that means that we have to face, as humanitarians, the uncomfortable questions that I think what you thought were like harsh thug is maybe more realism, I would say. Maybe it's about the, as political philosophy would call it, realism. So maybe that's what we have to call it. It doesn't mean, it's the only answer, but it is a answer, and it's funny to look forward to it. We have one comment or one hand up. Shall we take it? And then we can come back to Nenki and Hugo, or anyone else in the audience if you want to have a final word. We have 3 minutes. So Abdul, who is it? It's Abdul Razka. Hassan.
Hey,
No?
hello, and thanks
Yes,
for letting me talking. I just have regarding the presentation, and thanks for it, and explaining about potentials and all the plans. I just want to raise the question about ICVA's plan in the region, in Middle East region, and especially for Syrian context. As, for example, when we are talking about Syrian people, we are talking about Syrian in Syria as IDPs and as refugees in the nearby countries. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Context Syria, of course, is very important there. Delphine has asked the final question from me preemptively. Thank you, Delphine. What's next?
I was about to pass it back.
Well, actually, what's next? I mean, I'll say, but then you say from the impact. So just in terms of this little report, so we're doing 2 roundtables this week, this lovely one with you, which is quite a lot of people. And then we did a very nice one at IFRC with about 20 of their sort of tech, leaders and things. That was very good. And then we're trying to set up one with faith-based people which we hope will be hosted by WCC and ACT. Hopefully, I'm just putting the date with them now, end of Feb, March. And then the Norwegian government have said, because they published a paper in Oslo, or Oslo published a paper, that they will host a roundtable in Geneva of states. And I haven't talked, this only was confirmed yesterday. And Nanki and I were just saying, we hope that we will persuade them to make it a real roundtable, which has governments from Africa and Asia and the Middle East as well, and not just donors. But we'll see. And if they just want to be donors, we'll just be donors with them. And then we might go to the AU or someone and ask them to host a roundtable of states with, G77, African Union states, people. That's what I'm thinking. And the other thing is that I did do a spin-out paper that came out end of last week on prioritization itself, which I'll ask Mirella or Jamie to send around to you all. But thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I think ultimately, every time we have one of these conversations, and this is, I think, the third for us, we realize this is a much bigger conversation than we thought it was at the outset, and really comes to the heart of who we are as a sector and who we want to be, I suppose. And so from our side, I think this is really the start of a conversation, and we hope to continue to pick this up moving forward.
Delphine, you want to come back when we wrap up?
Well, I won't pretend trying to wrap up the very rich discussion, but perhaps just a discussion, because roundtables are fantastic and the conversation is obviously really important. But at the same time, I think the only way of knowing if a new concept really works is testing it. And I was wondering if, whether it's the Norwegian funding or at some point, and perhaps in the context of the Emergency Relief Coordinator flagship initiative, which is really giving the opportunity to really try different things. It could be in one of those countries or elsewhere, but should we actually test this way of, identifying humanitarian needs, say in 2024, even if we did it in one context, and then we compare with what the traditional humanitarian needs assessment and HRP development process has come up with using the GF and all, and see where we land. So that could be really interesting. Over. And thank you for organizing this conversation today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for leading us off and kicking us off into questions. It was much appreciate you and Jamal. Thanks to both of you for joining us and letting us lead on this. Thanks to everyone for joining. It's been super informative for me personally, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And if we can do more of these sort of things, I think that's very good. And thanks so much for joining. Over.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Jamie. Thank you, Mirella, so much for setting it up.
Sorry, I have to.